Welcome to the Kip and Ange podcast, Faith, Spirituality, and Cults in San Francisco. And today we'll be talking about Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Hey, Ange.
Hi, Kip. How are you?
Woo, just pushing through. Good day today. Slept in. I have my real job. I took the day off, so
I have the day off for my real job for the moment. Yeah.
Hey,
So,
that's
and
nice. Right on.
yeah, I lagged off with some other social media to sort of focus on us today. And
Yeah.
and I just want to, before we get started, there's some new YouTube subscribers, and I just want to say, hey, you guys, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy the show on YouTube. And just to let you know, if you're a podcast, if you're a listening type person, we're also available on several other podcast formats.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a podcasty person. That's the way to go. That's the way
I'm a visual person, which is why we ended up on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my obsession. So, and then also our VIP Patreon, which you give such a great shout out to every time we do a show. You just pronounce her name like 5 different ways.
How do you
Girlfriend Renee, we love you.
So today we're talking about Jim Jones and the People's Temple. And yes, they did have a tragic ending, but we're going to be talking about their time here in San Francisco. Now, most people are familiar with the tragedy known as the Jonestown Massacre. Like I said, it's not what we're going to be talking about today. There are many sources for that part of the story, but this podcast is about San Francisco, so that's what we're focusing on.
I'll throw a link in at the end for you guys if you really want to go check out the story. There's a fantastic documentary. I'll link you to it.
Oh yeah. Have fun in that rabbit hole. We've been stuck in it for days.
Yeah.
So, like I said, there's a lot of sources for that part of the story. All you have to do is type it into Google or check our links below to find out our favorites. Now, what we would really like to talk about, though, is the time that Jim Jones spent in San Francisco leading the People's Temple. It was located at 1859 Geary Street. It's now a U.S. post office.
Yeah, we went there.
We did go there. It's near the
you'll see our
bakery
original
too.
Pictures. You will see our original pictures of where the People's Temple once stood, and then I will also throw some pictures up of the actual People's Temple.
It's right near Jane the Bakery, right? And
it's a little further down. It's kind of just past the high school on Geary Boulevard, and there's a big post office, and that's where the post office is literally where it was.
I equate all my San Francisco landmarks with what kind of baked goods are nearby. So there you go. So I digress. Jones started his career as a Pentecostal preacher in Gary, Indiana. That's in 1959. And he established a reputation for human and civil rights there in Indianapolis. And he spoke openly about racial integration. And it was very progressive for the time, some really good stuff. And then
I could see where he would have some growing pains there over.
Oh, in Indiana?
Yeah.
I've heard you mention something about that. Okay. So Jones moved his congregation to California, to Ukiah in 1965. Flower power, seriously. And then back into San Francisco in 1971. Now, following this move, he adopted the moniker of the prophet. That's what he'd call himself. He called himself the prophet. And when
a cult is born.
Yeah, the cult is born. It was after they moved to California, to Ukiah in the early 70s, that the surviving followers, the people who actually made it out of Guyana, say that Jones started to become obsessed with power. San Francisco, Jim Jones in San Francisco at the time, he was known as a really big deal, and he worked to make himself a bigger deal. He began to garner public attention, not just in San Francisco. He got big. That's when he started getting attention on a national level. And he was joining up with other clergy in the city, working toward really good things, I say, like racial integration, civil rights. Hello. And his congregation started growing and growing. In fact, from what we read, I believe it was as big as it ever got, was in San Francisco,
it was
right, Angela?
It was in the thousands.
Mm.
It was in the thousands. In fact, Jones, he could Reverend Cecil Williams, he could mass numbers for protests, for unions, and that would give him significant political power within the city. As we discussed before, that was quite controversial when the Glide Church got involved on that level. But he
Right.
was an ally, and there's tons of pictures of Jim Jones with all kinds of politicians from the state of California. But soon his paranoia started to build, and Jones started to convince his congregation to start turning their incomes, their whole incomes, over to him. So now we have to remember he's kind of a um, progressive, real progressive, maybe even socialist kind of thinking preacher. So convincing people to turn over their entire incomes was probably not something unusual in the environment in which he was preaching in. So, and I actually know two former members of the People's Temple that live here in San Francisco and did not move to Guyana because they just had other stuff going on.
What did they say about him?
Well,
I'm so curious.
they spoke of Jones in a surprisingly reverent manner. I
Oh,
mean,
why, yeah.
they really,
Still,
really,
though, huh?
they felt like that moment in San Francisco, regardless of what Jones had going on personally, that they were affecting change. That even
Yeah.
still they were affecting change. And though
Yeah.
even years later, they found out through the documentaries and through research that, about the taking of the incomes, and that Jones was even, interestingly enough, faking faith healings, which is, faith healing is a very Pentecostal thing to do, but at
As
this
a yeah.
point, he had become an evangelical preacher,
And they
and
don't do that.
that's
You know more about all that than I
it's well,
do.
my mother was an evangelical preacher, and
Okay.
there is faith healing, but not to the extent that Jim Jones was doing, and he was completely faking him. And there's, in one of the video that I'm going to link you guys to, there's a woman that they out, they just out, she couldn't walk before the service and could walk after he faith healed her. So, even after knowing that, they feel like the experiences that they had legit positive influences
Yeah.
on their personal
Yeah.
journeys and finding their own spirituality. And so
I get it, man.
I
I
get it
get it.
too. He
I
was
do.
he was a charismatic being.
Hmm.
So yeah,
And I've run into him. You've run into him. Um,
charismatic beings, not Jim Jones.
Eventually, Jones became so paranoid, he convinced a huge portion, more than 900 people, to move to his new utopia there in a jungle in Guyana. And he started that big move out of San Francisco, immigrating all these people, not all of them, but so many of them.
900, more than 900 people.
Yeah, more than 900 people, and ultimately resulting in the death, if you know anything about this case, of 913 people from this cult. And at this time, it was not, it was a cult. I mean, I don't know how else to
Oh,
describe it at that
for
point. Like,
sure.
it's full-blown cults.
When you guys see the story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. 276 of them were kids. 412 unclaimed bodies from the Jonestown mass suicide and murders are buried together in Oakland, California at the Evergreen Cemetery. So you can actually visit that yourself. That's
He
crazy.
he took what happened is that he was really into inviting the marginalized into his church, and so there was a lot of elderly people that were on Social Security, which is how
Uh,
he convinced them to give them, he said, we will take care of you in your old age, you just turn over your Social Security checks
and
to
at the time, I can
us.
see how people thought, well, gosh, we trust him. He loves us. Why wouldn't this sounds like a great option for us?
So
That's
then
unfortunate.
he takes them out, and what happens? I want to talk about the phrase drank the Kool-Aid, because I don't think a lot of people understand where it came from, and I just want to quickly talk about that. And first of all, I want to correct that it wasn't actually Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid. So Kool-Aid's gotten a really bad rap over the years. The way that the people in Guyana died were, by a majority, they were poisoned by drinking the Flavor Aid. And there were some people that were shot and murdered and committed suicide with guns.
His kids got out though, right? Didn't his kids like
He has a surviving son, Jim
yeah.
Jones Jr.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
He's out there. He's a nice guy.
Yeah, I've seen him on YouTube and stuff, yeah.
That might very well be one of the people I know who was not in Guyana at the time that happened. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that there are people in San Francisco that still are either traumatized by this or, you know, inspired and traumatized in a weird way. That's it for the Kif and Ange podcast this week. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and notify, and make sure you know when the next video drops. Make sure you watch for our next series, Protests, Sit-ins, and Riots in the History of San Francisco, coming soon.